Thank you so much for joining us for this briefing. We really appreciate it. My name is Annette Bernhardt. I'm a director of the Low Wage Work Program at the UC Berkeley Labor Center, and I'm here with Sarah Thomason, co-author on this report, who is also a researcher in the Low Wage Work Program. Just some logistics. The plan for the webinar is we're going to do around 25 to 30 minutes of presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions. I should flag at the outset, if you've had a chance to look at the report, it's got a lot of information, and we clearly won't be able to cover it all here. Also, I should say we've got a really diverse audience, which is great. We've got lots of different types of groups and stakeholders represented here. So we're going to try not to go into too much data geek detail, but rest assured the report has lots of it, and it's often in the endnotes. And then in terms of logistics, we've put everyone on mute, and then when it comes time for questions, we'll try to answer as many as we can. And then, of course, we're always available for follow-ups, and we're eager to help people and provide any technical assistance that we can. And then I just really want to make sure at the start to thank the funders who supported this work, the Ford Foundation and the California Wellness Foundation. So to start, the report was actually really written for people like you. This was not a report intended to, get a big splash in the media with new data. It was written for people who are trying to figure out policy responses to gig work. So that's policymakers themselves, it's worker organizations, unions, think tanks, researchers, and foundations. And the reason we wrote it is that while I think all of us, of course, share the concern that we may be seeing a shift from W-2 work to gig work, and if so, that will require a lot of thinking about people's access to safety net programs, their coverage by labor standards, whether they have enough economic security in their work lives and their family lives. So at the same time, however, there is, and I think you've probably all found this, there's a lot of confusion out there about how many gig workers there are, whether the number has been growing, what are their job characteristics, what are their demographics, etc. So as an example, okay, whoops. Sorry. As an example, even if we just ask a simple question of how many gig workers there are in the US, you can get an answer anywhere from 600,000 to 55 million. Clearly not helpful if we're trying to figure out policy responses. And in our analysis, we think there's two things going on here in terms of confusion. One, there's very different definitions of gig work out there. People mean gig work to indicate everybody from Uber drivers to all contingent workers. And then two, the many studies out there use very different data sets and methods, and they vary quite a bit in how rigorous they are. And so the goal of this report is to try to help clear some of that up. With the idea that, and I think everyone would agree, we need to have a shared and accurate understanding of what gig work is, which workers are doing it, and how it's being used to generate income. So the report goals are: one, we want to provide a clear framework to help define gig work. And then two, we identify what we know and especially what we don't know about gig work. And in that, we both draw on our own analysis, but we also present data from other studies. And I should say we've done a lot of work to identify the studies that we think are rigorous, that have representative data, etc. So let me, and then let me just say, to some extent, the report is focused on California, but actually a lot of this material applies to other states and nationally as well. So why don't we start by presenting a framework to help us think about gig work. In our minds, there are really three dimensions here to analyzing work in the new economy. And these are often conflated, and we think that is the reason for a lot of the confusion out there. So first, we think it's really important when we're trying to figure out what types of work we're talking about to differentiate between employees and independent contractors. That is the fundamental distinction in the US system of employment and labor laws, in our safety net system. It's really the key distinction that drives a lot of what workers can expect in terms of protection in the workplace. And then underneath each of these categories, we've broken down subtypes. So under independent contractors, one type is, of course, the online platform workers like Uber and TaskRabbit, but there's also a lot of very traditional independent contractors, such as architects and construction workers, real estate brokers, and hairstylists. And then under employees, we have both the traditional in-house permanent workers, but we also have employees of contractor firms. And here we're thinking of subcontractors, temp agencies, et cetera, firms that provide goods and services to other firms, like, for example, janitorial services companies or call center workers. But the important thing to point out here is that these workers most often actually do have employers, and they are in a standard employment relationship. And that is why they are under the employee box. Some folks understandably want to also talk about these workers when talking about gig workers or contingent work, which is totally understandable, but we should be very clear that they are most often employees and likely need a different analysis than independent contractors. So that's the first sort of set of distinctions. The second one, and this is a source of a lot of confusion, is to differentiate main jobs versus supplemental income. So in the US, most workers are employees only. Some workers are independent contractors only. And then some workers combine both types of work, often for supplemental income. This distinction is often not made. So when you see some of the big numbers about the number of gig workers we have in the US, you know, like 40% of workers will be gig workers by 2020. You guys have probably heard that one. Whenever you see big numbers about the number of gig workers, it is usually because people are counting independent contractors who are doing it full-time as their main job, and then anybody else who does any type of independent contracting on the side for supplemental income. So even if somebody just gets a 1099 for, you know, $700 for some writing or some work they did on the side last year, they would be counted as a gig worker, even though their main job is a W-2 job. And we think that that is probably not a useful conflation to make. Because this is really about trying to do an accounting of the number of jobs in our economy. And so if we're trying to track, you know, our W-2 jobs declining, our gig work jobs growing, we need to be clear about, are we talking about main jobs or are we just talking about supplemental activity? And then finally, on job quality, to make an obvious point, it's good to distinguish between good jobs and bad jobs. But the reason we put this up here is because there's been a tendency of late to equate gig jobs with bad jobs. And we think that that is probably not that useful. There's plenty of good jobs in independent contracting. People, you know, have a full career, like management consultants and accountants and lawyers. And on the other hand, there's plenty of bad jobs in W-2 employment. And in fact, the majority of bad jobs, i.e. low wage and no benefits at this point, actually are W-2 jobs where there's an employer, where there's a regular employment relationship. So we think more useful, rather than doubling down, you know, on which type of employment relationship is the worst, we think it's more useful to ask, you know, for a given type of employment relationship, what are the job quality outcomes, like the ones you see on your screen, and what causes their variation. The definition of gig work that we use in this report is independent contractors, including but not limited to on-demand platform workers. There are other totally valid definitions of gig work, but again, from the standpoint of public policy, we think this is the most useful way to define gig work because employees and independent contractors have very different legal standing in the US. As you all know, independent contractors are excluded from key employment and labor laws, such as minimum wage, OSHA, and right to organize. and are excluded generally from benefits and social insurance programs accessed via employee status, such as employer-provided health insurance. So that means that independent contractors may well require different policy approaches if we want to think about providing these workers with labor standards and a safety net. So given that definition, let me talk a little bit about prevalence. The big question, how many people work as independent contractors? Again, the report has a lot of detail, and I'm just going to give you the top line here. So if we ask the employment status of workers at their main job last week, so you say, what were you mainly doing last week? What was your main job? And tell me about that job. For the majority of workers in the US, they are employees, as you can tell, and in California. And then in California, another 8.5% are independent contractors, a little bit higher than the US. And then 3.7% are small business owners. We can talk more about that distinction, but basically small business owners are typically incorporated. They will have employees. They may have invested capital, like in restaurants, whereas independent contractors typically are unincorporated. They largely work for themselves. So if we're defining independent contracting, gig work as independent contracting, we're saying our best estimate is 8.5% of workers in California are independent contractors. And that may seem like a small number to you if you've heard some of the studies that have put much bigger percentages on the number of gig workers in the economy. But again, here we're focusing on people just reporting what their main job is. And the answer looks a little bit different if we look at people doing independent contracting, self-employment across all jobs. And that is what this second slide is. Here we're drawing on tax data, and unfortunately we don't have these numbers for the US. But again, the majority of workers last year only earned wages. In the US, another 7.2% earned self-employment income only, and this is just for independent contractors. And then the 6.1% earned both wages and self-employment income. This is really the first time we've had a glimpse at how many people are doing supplemental, independent contracting for supplemental work. And that is really what this estimate is. We took a little bit closer look at that third category, and it does look like the majority of those are largely depending on their W-2 jobs, and then they're doing the self-employment for additional earnings. And this is a pretty consistent finding from some other studies about the mix of main jobs versus supplemental income for independent contractors. So this is our, these two charts are basically our best, having gone through a lot of data and different studies, our best statement on the prevalence estimates, given imperfect data and incomplete data. This is the best we can do right now in terms of prevalence. But I do want to talk about, finally, I should say these numbers, sorry, my PowerPoint's going a little bit nuts. These numbers that we just showed do include on-demand platform workers like Uber, et cetera. And there we actually do have good data. There's been a bunch of recent studies showing that, you know, pretty much consistently less than 1% of the workforce uses on-demand platforms like Uber, like TaskRabbit, et cetera. And, you know, it may be that as we get better data, that number grows a little bit or shrinks a little bit, but the point here is that orders of magnitude, this is actually still a quite small percent of the workforce. All right, so having covered prevalence, the next question, of course, is trends. Is the number of independent contractors, i.e. gig workers, growing? And as I'm sure you've seen, the prevailing idea in the public discussion is that there's been an explosion in gig work. And that's been very consistently out there, and I think a lot of us have been feeling it, or we're hearing it from workers, but it is actually has been hard to find evidence of that explosion in data. So here's where things get a little bit complicated, so just bear with me. In California, again, if you ask workers what they were doing last week, What's plotted here is a percent saying I was an independent contractor and the percent saying I was a small business owner. And this shows basically completely flat lines. So there's no way to get out of this graph that there's been explosion in the number of folks who are saying that they're independent contractors over the last couple of decades. And this holds true, by the way, for the US as well. This is a very consistent finding. But note again, here we're just plotting people who say, this is my main job. The trend lines look a little bit different when, again, you look at any type of income generating activity, whether it's for a main job or not. And that's what's shown in this graph. And let me just explain to you, this comes from tax data in California. It's the number of sole proprietor tax filings. Basically, that is a rough measure of independent contractors. I won't go into the gory details, but if you're an independent contractor, you have to file Schedule C and usually SE. That's what this is showing. And you can see for most industries, the trend lines are flat since 2000. But there's two categories where we actually do see an increase in these independent contractor tax filings. One is in the services industry, and the other one, intriguingly, is the nature of business unknown. And this is basically where the filers are not putting down any industry on their tax form. And so, of course, one wants deeply to know who those are, but we haven't been able to get an answer on that yet. But again, this graph combines both doing independent contracting for a main job and for just getting some supplementary income on the side. And we are not able to determine which of those is driving these two lines that are increasing. So on the question of, has gig work been growing, our conclusion is that at this point, it's basically not possible to come up with a definitive answer. We are really going to need better data that allows us to especially differentiate how people are using independent contracting and how much of their income it's providing. So on that one, I think we're going to have to wait a bit to get access to better data. One possible hypothesis that folks have put out is, well, maybe the thing that has been growing is people are doing this stuff more for supplementary income, to make up for wage stagnation. People and their families need more money to get by, so they're adding this gig work on the side. And that is one plausible interpretation of these two graphs I showed you. But I don't want to get out ahead of where the data are. It may be that, down the line we discover we just had bad measures all along. So not a totally satisfying answer, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're dealing with in terms of time trends. I'm now going to turn this over to Sarah Thomason, who's going to tell us a little bit more about independent contractors in California.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. And for this next section, I'm going to talk about another thing that we looked at in our report, which is who are independent contractors and what kind of work they are doing. So this is something we're really interested in, and we know that you all are too, because it's going to really shape the kinds of responses that you come up with to these issues. And for this section, we are looking at independent contractors at their main job. So we're not including people who are doing independent contracting as a side job. And here we're also looking specifically at California. So looking at demographics, there are some significant differences between independent contractors and employees. Compared to employees, independent contractors in California are more likely to be older men. They're more likely to be white, but about half are workers of color. Educational attainment is similar to employees, but we do see a larger group of workers that don't have a high school degree. In our report, we don't look at the trends of demographics changing over time, but other studies have found that the rates of self-employment have been growing among women and immigrants over the past few decades. Next, we look at the industries. So what types of work are these independent contractors doing? So here we're listing some industries that are, well, first I want to say, overall what we found is that the types of work that independent contractors are doing are very diverse. So we find them in all different sectors of the economy, but there are some differences between the types of work that they are doing compared to employees. So that's what we want to look at here. First, we have some of the industries that are more common among independent contractors compared to employees. The biggest one is other services, and that includes beauty salons, childcare workers, home care workers. Some of the other industries that are more common are construction, professional services and management of companies, and also administrative and waste management services. And that industry includes workers like janitors, security guards, landscapers. We also list here some of the industries that are less common among independent contractors, such as healthcare and retail trade. And so another question that we wanted to ask, which we know is also really important to you, is independent contracting a good job? And again, here we're looking only at main job, and we're looking specifically at California. We found that independent contractors are more likely to be involuntarily part-time. They're also more likely to be uninsured, about 20% of independent contractors compared to only 11% of employees are uninsured. And they're also much more likely to be using public health insurance, such as Medicaid or Medicare. We really wanted to look at earnings and figure out whether or not independent contractors are making more, less, or about the same as employees, but unfortunately, we just don't have good data right now. We did, in our report, come up with a range for an estimate of median annual earnings, and we get this from our low estimate is based on what workers self-report are their net income, like their net earnings. And then our high estimate is based off of an estimate from the IRS of how much these workers are underreporting when they're reporting their taxes. And so their most recent estimate is that independent contractors only report 36% of their net income. So that's what we applied here to get the high-end estimate. But as you can see, between 24,000 and 67,000, it's a pretty big range, and so we're not able to say definitively how that compares to the earnings of employees. But one thing is clear, we do know that the majority of low-wage workers are W-2 workers. But so even though we're not able to get a precise measurement of wages comparing them to those of employees, we also use another strategy to try to get at who are independent contractors that are earning low wages and high wages. So in this next slide, what we've done is we've looked at the most common occupations of independent contractors, and then we very roughly grouped them into categories based on the hourly wage. And the hourly wages aren't based on the earnings of independent contractors because, like I said, we don't have reliable data on their earnings. So here we've used the average hourly wage of W-2 employees in these occupations. So first, low-wage occupations that are common among independent contractors. These include janitors, home health aides, retail sales workers. Next, when we look at those earning in between sort of a low to mid-wage, we see construction workers, beauty salon and nail salon workers. In the mid-wage category, we have managers, we have media and communications workers, and teachers. In between mid-wage and high wage, we have business operations specialists, counselors and social workers. And at the top, in the high wage category, we have doctors, nurses, lawyers, executives. And we also found that the demographics of independent contractors really vary across this occupational spectrum. So women, immigrants, and Latinos are disproportionately employed in these low-wage occupations, and we see that men and white independent contractors are predominantly, well, disproportionate in the higher wage occupations. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Annette for some final thoughts before we take questions.
All right, great. So, so on the final thoughts, and again, sorry, you guys are PowerPoint seems to be jumping all over the place. We want to move on to Q&A, but wanted to say a couple of things about sort of major takeaways beyond the specific estimates on prevalence and worker and job characteristics. What really, I think, jumps out to us is the sheer diversity of the independent contractor workforce in California. It is, as we saw, diverse in terms of the industries and jobs that independent contractors do. It's diverse in how they do their work, who their customers are, and the fact that many actually are not using on-demand platforms, though they may well be using technology. And diverse in terms of how they use independent contracting. Some do it full-time, many do it part-time for short stints. Some of those do it out of necessity. Actually, many say they do it out of choice. So the upshot is that there are many different worlds of work for independent contractors. Clearly, as we said at the beginning, they share some things. They are typically not covered by minimum wage or other worker rights. They typically don't have access to the safety net. And as Sarah just said, as is true for W-2 workers, independent contractors are really stratified by race, ethnicity, gender, and immigration status in their jobs. But independent contractors also differ significantly. They differ in how much they earn. They therefore differ in their ability to buy health care, their ability to save for retirement, and we suspect they differ in their risk of misclassification, which we think is very likely higher for low-wage independent contractors. We haven't said much about misclassification, but happy to do so during Q&A. But the upshot is, I think, to us, this really raises the question of whether these workers all need and want the same thing when we think about policy solutions. They're often treated as one undifferentiated group, or in policy discussions only talk about Uber drivers. But in fact, I think the upshot from this report is that they're very varied, and they may well need and want different policy responses. And so as a final technical note, then, if we're going to try to get at a better understanding of this workforce, I would be remiss as a researcher not to call for better data and research. But that really, and those of you who are in this area know, there really is a very dire need for much better data and research. And we actually think state agencies can help here. So just as an example of some of the things that I think we need better data on, that we should be trying to put our heads together to figure out how to get access to it. We need better data on prevalence and trends over time. We need a better understanding of gig work as supplemental income. I would flag that one is really important. We need better data on earnings. And we need research to document variation in job quality outcomes, especially misclassification.